Gopal, pleasure to be with you again. Given the fact that this is quite a truncated session, I could speak to you for hours on your book. I'm going to jump right in. But I want to start with the fact that this is a monumental book. What were your fears and concerns when you started thinking about this project?
It is a book which includes personal memories and history as has been recorded. So I was afraid that my memories of my own childhood, of my family, will dominate the historical narrative, which would be a very selfish thing to do. And I was afraid that the balance between history and personal recollection would not work. That was the main fear.
Okay. I know you're averse to reading from the book, but I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to read a very, very poignant passage that deals with the assassination of your grandfather, the Mahatma. Could you read from that passage, please? Or at least speak about it.
Well, I'll start by saying that I have a granddaughter who is now 9, but when she was much smaller, and I used to try to tell her a story, and I would say, "Shall I tell you a story about Bapuji?" And she would say, "No, no, no." But now I am being asked to tell a story about him, and so I'll try to do that without making it dramatic or sentimental. Now, his assassination has to be seen in the context of the fact that anywhere between 200,000 and 2 million Indian individuals died in the India-Pakistan partition riots at that time. Nearly 2 million, some say more. And about 12 to 20 million were displaced. So his assassination should be seen in the context of a much greater tragedy, which left millions of homes completely bereft. Now, to combine personal recollection with history, I have no memory of the assassination because I was 2.5, but I am told by my sister and my brothers that on that afternoon, my sister and I were alone in our house. My father was working in his office, my mother was somewhere else. And when somebody came and whispered to my sister that your grandfather has been shot. So she just grabbed me and ran down. We were in a second-floor house, and there was a car waiting that took us to the place. And she tells me that when she reached, by the time she reached with me on her shoulder, there was already a small crowd that had gathered, not a large, but a small crowd, but the police were in charge, and she and I, in her hands, were stopped from going. And she said, "You can't go, nahi ja sakte, nahi ja sakte." She said, "Par main unki poti hu, I am his granddaughter." So there was some doubt about that. And then, can you hear me? You can't hear me? I'm sorry you can't hear me. I was told that this mic works very well, but maybe I should use this mic. But if you have not heard me so far, let me tell you, you have not missed too much. Please. And if you're going to hear me better, you probably will not be too glad to be hearing what you are hearing either. Is it better now?
Yeah, fine.
Somewhat better now? So I reached this. My sister was told, "You can't go into the house. Who are you?" And she said, "But main unki poti hu, I am his granddaughter." And we went in, and again, as I am told, he had been laid down on the ground, and when I looked at him, I said what I used to say at his behest. He used to ask me to say this, I believe, "Sab shant ho jaye, chup, 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 sab shant ho jaye." And when I saw him lying down, I said the same thing apparently. Bapuji सो रहे हैं, चुप, सब शांत हो जाइए. And that led to another bout of crying. But family histories of that time include one very important figure, and that is his eldest son. His eldest son, Harilal, was in Bombay on the day of the assassination. And we are told that he was in a tea shop when he heard this on the radio. And he stood up and said what any son in his position can be expected to say. He said in Hindi, and I'll say it in English, I will murder the man who has killed my father. This was Harilal. The most spontaneous and natural reaction, and he rushed out. One son prayed, another son fasted, third son, I think, traveled. But Harilal said, I will murder the man who has killed my father. This was the reaction in the family. And there was one other member of the family whose reaction I may share. He was at that time governor of West Bengal. Rajagopalachari was Gandhi's sambandhi. And when he heard this news, he was walking to a function and he retreated and asked to be put on the phone to the Governor General Mountbatten. And all he said to Mountbatten was, Governor General, please see to Jawaharlal's security, and put the phone down. That was the administrator in Rajagopalachari. And after that, as he says, he sat down to cry. But his first reaction was the security of the Prime Minister of India. 200,000 to 2 million dead was the scene in which Gandhi fell. And as was said by a philosopher, he was not stopped by 3 bullets. He stopped 3 bullets in their track. And those 3 bullets may be called hate, fear, and untruth. These were the 3 bullets that he stopped.
Gopal, one more question related to the assassination of the Mahatma, and that was the family's reaction. You've talked about some of the reaction, but the reaction to the assassin, Godse. You are opposed to capital punishment. You've written a book about it. What do you think you would have done if you were of a mind to have a say in how the assassin was dealt with?
I think the handing of the death penalty to Nathuram Godse and to Narayan Apte was singularly unfortunate. We do not realize very often that the first executions in independent India, the first executions in independent India were of Godse and of Apte. And I have no doubt at all that Gandhi would have been mortified if he had known that this is what is happening. There was an irony to it. And very similarly, in the United States, the first woman to ever be hanged was Mary Surratt, who was implicated, as it later turns out, quite wrongly, in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. If Narayan Apte and Nathuram Godse had not been handed the death penalty, which is something which was in the power of the government of the day to do, and it was open to the new government to open a new chapter in the matter of penology and particularly in the matter of capital punishment. A very transformational and healing act would have been done. I believe Godse's hanging was extremely unfortunate. And I must say here and quickly leave David to ask the next question. At home, I have never heard from anyone senior to me and later on my peers a single word of recrimination about Godse. I do not know how this has happened, but I attribute it to the influence of the man who fell at Godse's hands. Never was Godse ever spoken of in our home in terms of disparagement. Disapproval, yes, but not disparagement. And I am very glad of that, for then there would have been bitterness, rancor in the family, and that would have been an extremely unfortunate thing to happen.
I'm going to briefly summarize what Gopal said, because apparently people at the back can't hear very clearly. I don't know what the solution is to that, because I think it'll be a bit weird to keep summarizing. But my question was, what did you think of what were your views on the hanging of the Mahatma's assassin? And he said it was unfortunate. And he also said that the family never disparaged Godse or Apte. Would that be an accurate summary?
It's a very accurate summary, and I'm sorry you could not able to hear me, but if you're able to hear David, his summary, you've done better than if you had heard me.
Surprisingly, you say, the biggest influence on your life was not the Mahatma, but your other grandfather, Rajaji. Could you speak to that a bit, please?
I was expecting this question, particularly as it is Chennai that we are meeting in. Without any doubt whatsoever, I regard Rajaji as my grandfather and Gandhi as everybody's grandfather or father. And not everybody need regard Gandhi as their forefather, but Rajaji was very intimately related to his family and to his grandchildren, particularly so. I believe I was under his spell because that is the effect he had on most people. He dazzled by his intellect and by his articulation. And I think he impressed more than he persuaded. He left the impression of brilliance, luminosity of the intellect, rather than a person who has inspired you or changed you. And he certainly had that effect on me. And one solid impact that he had on me was his telling me, when I was toying with the idea of joining the great profession that has brought all of us here together, namely journalism, he said, journalism is all right, but after you have got to know something about life, how can you write about life before you've known it? So you should either be a lawyer, and if you choose to be a lawyer in Chennai, with me in Chennai, I think you will have a good practice. But better still, I think you should be an administrator, for then you will get to know the pulse of life. And if I had not taken his advice, I would have probably lost my job in the first newspaper I had joined very soon after I joined it.
Well, staying with Rajaji, when India became a republic in 1950, he should have become president, but he didn't. Could you talk us through those days, please?
Well, Nehru certainly wanted him to be president, but his party did not want him to be president. And the reason was that he did not toe the party line in 1942 when the Quit India movement was surging ahead and he had a different view. And then again, as I said, he was a man who didn't persuade a following. He impressed the persons he was speaking to, the persons he was writing for, but he did not consciously, deliberately cultivate anyone, including or probably even particularly people in his party. But he should have been president. I think he would have been an extraordinary first citizen of India when the office of the president was inaugurated. But there is something beyond the satisfactions of incumbency. David, I think, in the fact that he left the office without a backward glance, without a single note of regret, and showering his affection and goodwill on the first president, Rajendra Prasad, gave Rajaji a moral dividend which he would not have had if he had actually become president. Rajaji moved from being the first and last Indian Governor General of India to becoming the best president India never had, and more than that, a person with a moral right to speak on the dangers of power and the delusions of high office. He acquired and used that moral stature when he then was asked to come back as a minister, which he did again without any ego. Nehru said, "Come back, we need you as a minister." He joined as a minister. But when he found that he was not being useful or being used, he came back to Chennai. And in Chennai, when he was asked to become chief minister by the Congress party, which had been reduced to a minority in the assembly, and Kamaraj said, "You should become chief minister, please, please do." He said, "Very well," and gave it a shot. But ego was not his companion. Ideals were his companion. He was, I think, David, cast in the mold of Marcus Aurelius and the great Roman philosophers who were in the public arena, who were there because of the loftiness of their vision and the desire to just introduce public order according to the highest standards of public and civil expectations.
One other difference with this session, if there will be time for questions at the end of it, but rather than asking the questions, if you could just write them on slips of paper and send them up, I will read them out and the questions will be answered. Just please bear that in mind. You spend a lot of time in your book on India's first Prime Minister, Nehru. Clearly you admired him a great deal. What were the things that you most liked about him, and also had reservations about?
Nehru was essentially a historian, then a Democrat, and third, a man of peace. These three things have to be seen together. And binding the three together, historian, Democrat, and a man of peace, was a natural man of letters. I think these 3, 4 combinations made him an amazing first Prime Minister of India, because India needed a sense of new history. The most unnatural thing had happened, the partitioning of India, the most unnatural and disastrous thing of which we are still paying a price. The mutilation of life, the changing of political boundaries impacting on natural boundaries like rivers. And I think it required a man like Nehru to say very first few months of independence that Pakistan is a fact. We have to live with it, but let us not live with it with poison in our hearts. He was an extremely fallible human being like anyone else. And I think that endears him to me more. He made mistakes of a very strange kind very early on. In 1953, his arrest of Sheikh Abdullah and holding Sheikh Abdullah in prison for 11 years without trial is incomprehensible to me. And I think it's a blot on his career. His dismissing the Namboodiripad government, which was the first non-Congress government in India to be elected to office, within months of its being elected to office, was another extraordinary error. I cannot understand. How could a Democrat do this? But he was a Democrat. His attitude to the opposition in Parliament was extremely civil and cordial. But then he did make these mistakes. And I think to come back to Madras and to Rajaji and the Swatantra Party, I think it was essential that the Democrat in Nehru, which was probably going to deteriorate into a benevolent dictatorship, that Nehru was told, enough is enough. India needs an opposition. India needs dissent. Our democracy is not complete without a strong opposition. And Nehru was a bit rattled, but he did accept the fact that this new party from the political right was joining the political left in placing him in the dock and demanding that he be the Democrat that he is meant to be, and the historian of India's civilization that he intrinsically was. Nehru was an idealist, a historian, and an extremely fallible politician. But he was honest. He was sincere. He was ardent. And when he released Sheikh Abdullah months before he died, weeks just before he died, there was remorse in the man. I do not know if he ever expressed an apology to Namboodiripad and the Communist Party. But I think he saw that that was a horrible thing to have done. But in the case of Abdullah, there was remorse. We do not know the word sorry anymore. The word, I have made a mistake, the phrase, I have made a mistake, does not exist in the political vocabulary of India. I would really like to ask the question of this audience. When did we last hear any senior politician in India, whether in office or outside, say, I made a mistake? I would like to atone for it. It is always, I am right, you are wrong. And the word that today has become synonymous with political discussion is slam. Congress slams BJP. Amit Shah slams Mamata. Mamata slams XYZ. Slam. On the same page you'll find 3-4 slams. And of course several scams. But slam, adversarial emotions are not the politics that Nehru taught us, that Rajagopalachari taught us, that Namboodiripad taught us. Namboodiripad who wrote this trenchant criticism of Gandhi, but with great respect for the man. Respect has gone. Trust has gone. You know the Tamil word which is untranslatable, Nambikkai, Vishwasam, Yengiyo Purthu. Nehru inspired Nambikkai. Rajaji inspired Vishwasam. Both today are needed. Both today are missing.
So coming to contemporary politics, well, more or less contemporary, your first high-profile job was working with R. Venkatraman, first as vice president and then president. Can you tell us about the highs and lows of your position at that point?
Mr. Murari is here. He was secretary to President Venkatraman. I will say this. President Venkatraman was of the Kamaraj mold of politics, which was truthful, direct, accessible, rule-bound, and forward-looking. And I must share here this one anecdote which RV told me, that Kamaraj had, as Congress president, gone to the Soviet Union on a party-to-party visit, and RV accompanied him. And RV was not in office himself, and he told Kamaraj, just before they were seeing Brezhnev, the Ministry of External Affairs has given us no briefs, we have no papers, nobody has taken us seriously on the Indian side, and we are meeting Brezhnev. What do we tell Brezhnev? And Kamaraj said, "Ennanga yen kavalapadreenga? Why are you worried? Therinjade solrom, theriyadunu solrom, namakku enna kaval." Look at the honesty of that man. They were not interested, Kamaraj was not interested in scoring points with everyone. He was just doing a job. Theriyade solrom, theriyadunu solrom. No brief from MEA or any ministry could have been more helpful. And the meeting apparently was a great success. It lasted much longer than the scheduled time. R. Venkatraman was this kind of a person who became President of India, wanted to be a textbook president, was that. When VP Singh got the majority, he said, he has got the majority. He has to be sworn in. VP Singh became Prime Minister. There was no issue at all. A congressman who was president had no problem about swearing in a non-Congress government. Likewise, President K.R. Narayanan, who was not only a former congressman, but of a school of philosophy, which would have had very little in common with the Hindu right or the political or the non-political right, had absolutely not one moment of doubt that Vajpayee should be Prime Minister when Vajpayee had the mandate. And the two together were an exemplary Prime Minister and President together. For frankness was the key in their relationship. Frankness. K.R. Narayanan and R. Venkatraman were not robots in the President's office. In a very major interview with Mr. N. Ram, President Narayanan said, "I have no powers. The President has no powers." True, that's the constitutional position. But, he said, the President has something else. The President has influence. The President has influence when that view of the President is in tune with public opinion, when that public opinion is right. All these factors have to work together. Then the President has influence. The robotization of constitutional offices is a great tragedy of modern India. No president or governor should try to clutch at jurisdiction. This was a phrase RV used. No clutching of jurisdiction, but doing one's allotted task within the four corners of the Constitution and exerting the influence which comes from moral authority, not political authority. I believe the president and the governor and other heads of constitutional offices have a mind that has to be alert and active all the time. But they should not become too fond of their own voices. This is very important. But the voice should be there. And I think we have to now move from that great concept, David, which is called constitutional morality. Baba Sahib Ambedkar's great phrase, constitutional morality. That too is now not enough. We have to move from constitutional morality to what can be called constitutional conscience. Constitutional conscience. Granville Austin has used the phrase to describe the fundamental rights section and the directive principles of state policy as the conscience of the Constitution. But the Constitution's conscience has to be invoked by the authorities who are in their constitutional positions required to do so. That is very important. Silence is not constitutionalism. Compliance is not constitutionalism. Alert, awake applications of the conscience of the Constitution, that is what being a constitutional democracy is. That is what constitutional morality is about. We've heard an enchanting conversation between Mr. Ravi and the former Chief Justice of India. When the former Chief Justice of India spoke of dissent being the lungs of the democracy, of a democracy, I said, wow, this is what a Chief Justice is for. He described that as the lungs of democracy. Nehru, Kamaraj, Namboodiripad were representatives of the lungs of that democracy. And I will now close, David. You asked me about Rajaji, he was Chief Minister here. I spoke about Namboodiripad, who was the first non-Congress elected Chief Minister of India, in India. I will say that one of the great misfortunes of India was the death within 1 year of his becoming Chief Minister of the first non-Congress Chief Minister of Madras, post-independence, C.N. Annadure. Anna's death within a year robbed Tamil Nadu of the great chance of seeing democratic dissent installed by a popular mandate in office. I believe we started with the assassination of Gandhi. Death was in the air then, and I don't want death to dominate this conversation. But I think the great misfortunes of India have been the deaths within months of India's independence of Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, not counting the assassination, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. The death very soon, too soon after he became Prime Minister, of Lal Bahadur Shastri, and the death of C.N. Annadure. These three were one of the great complaints I have to make to the Almighty. But we must also say here, on a positive note, that all these persons have given us situations and statuses which continue. Sardar Patel has given us an integrated country with a sense of unity which is now being, shall I say, co-opted to justify those who want unity to become uniformity. But Sardar Patel gave us unity. But Lal Bahadur Shastri's great achievement was not just the victory in the 1965 war, which was a great victory and a great achievement, but I believe his greater achievement was in the Tashkent Declaration, which he signed hours before he died. The Tashkent Declaration, which opened a new chart, a completely new path in India-Pakistan relations. Likewise, and I must say here, The great 1971 victory was a great victory and gave the lie to the theory of nations, two nations based on religion. But greater than the 1971 victory itself was, I believe, the Shimla Agreement, in which Indira Gandhi gave again an absolutely new example of cooperation and accommodation between the two countries. Using this phrase, we do not want anything to mar our relations. Similar agreement. So we have had extraordinary agreements, extraordinary treaties in our country on which we must build a future of peace and good neighborliness in our region, without which what is happening now in Bangladesh can spill into a much bigger cauldron and take India right back to 1946 and 47. A horror that we must, by all means in our disposal, prevent. But I believe David's commissioning of this book by me got me to think of what its inner life should be of the book. And I said, it is the hope of civility and humanity in India. All the horrors that have happened are far less than the hopes that still persist, that still exist, that still subsist. And I'll just say one final word. In January, this very month, our government has signed with, not signed, but activated with Pakistan something which is very hope-giving. And all tributes to our government and to the government of Pakistan, believe it or not, with everything that has happened, Pulwama, Pahalgam, Delhi, Red Fort, two major steps taken by this government. The exchange of lists on our nuclear installations between the two countries. India and Pakistan have exchanged every year, 35 years continuously, lists of nuclear installations so that we do not stumble into or work consciously into a nuclear conflagration. This year too, this month we have exchanged those lists. And another list exchange is of prisoners we have in our midst. Former director of the CBI, so he knows exactly what this means. India and Pakistan have exchanged lists of prisoners from each other's countries in their jails. Absolutely incredible. This is again a bilateral agreement. And I believe if this exchange of lists can lead to the release of those prisoners, not excluding one person whom we have almost forgotten about. Kulbhushan Jadhav is still on death row in Pakistan. He must not hang.
They can't hear you, Gopal.
We started with a hanging. Let me conclude with a hang. Kulbhushan Jadhav is on the death row in Pakistan. Death penalty is wrong. He must not hang. Death penalty should hang, not people who are sentenced to death.
I have a lot more questions, Gopal, but there's so many questions that the audience has.
But David, you said we have a truncated session. Do we have time?
No, I'm going to go straight into question hour.
Please.
I was going to ask you more questions, but there are about 15 questions
I'll try to speak up in the answers.
Okay, so let's start with a question I was going to ask you, which somebody from the audience has, which says, you are a candidate for the VP election. Can you talk about your experience? How do you feel about your loss?
The VP elections are held by paper ballot, not EVMs. So my defeat was a totally true, completely correct defeat. And I must say this, as the votes were being counted, there were two trays. My tray had one paper come up over another. But Mr. Venkaiah Naidu's had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And before 10 minutes were over, I knew that Mr. Venkaiah Naidu was going to be the Vice President of India. And when I rang him to congratulate him, he said to me, believe it or not, these things happen. He said to me, I will come to Chennai and I will see you. I have great respect for Rajaji. And I said, oh my goodness, that's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. I have the pleasantest memories of that election.
Okay, the next question has to do with your stint as governor, briefly of Bihar and then of Bengal. What was the most controversial aspect of your tenure?
In Bengal?
Yeah.
The most controversial aspect of my tenure in Bengal was of my making. I said nobody says sorry these days, but let me say sorry today in one aspect of what I did. I made a public statement on Nandigram, which was, in my view, very necessary and which completely accorded with what President Narayanan had told Mr. Ram, that my view was in tune with public opinion. But I think, if instead of making a public statement, which I could not help myself make, if I had first told the then Chief Minister Buddhadev Bhattacharya in a conversation and said, Buddha Babu, what has happened is horrible. You know it and I know it. And I'm going to issue a public statement, but I want to tell you this before I issue a public statement. Is it all right? Buddha Babu was a decent enough man to have said, Governor, if you want to do so, do it. I am guilty of a little play of ego when I thought I should, so to say, share my grief with the public, which was in grief, but do so almost hastily without taking the Chief Minister into conference. The Chief Minister is the Chief Minister. He is in charge of the state. And again, in the same state of West Bengal, the last British governor, curiously enough, Frederick Burrows, in a meeting with Gandhi, asked Gandhi, Mr. Gandhi, now that the new government is coming, and what do you think I should do? What is my task? And Gandhi told Burrows, Mr. Governor, you want to know what you should do? Nothing. Nothing. You have nothing to do now. And I will conclude this question's answer by saying that Granville Austin apart, I got the most powerful lesson in constitutional propriety unintentionally from a correspondent in Bengal. Bengal is unique in its articulation. I got a lovely letter from a lady whom I had never met and whom I have never corresponded with later either. She sent me a lovely letter of appreciation for something. But you know how she started the letter? She addressed me in the following words. Greetings to the figurehead of the state. This was constitutional lesson number 1 and number last. Governor is figurehead of the state. Kintu, which is a favorite Bengali and Hindi word of mine, kintu. You hear in Bengal this kintu coming up very often. There's always a caveat. Governor is a figurehead of the state. Kintu, but not a figurehead with an empty mind. not a figurehead with a loud voice, but a figurehead with a thinking and engaging mind who follows both the principles and the propriety and the constitutional conscience of his office. Conscience is egoless. Conscience is egoless.
Okay, next question. What is your opinion on people who lionize Godse?
Could you repeat?
What is your opinion on people who lionize Godse?
My opinion on this is that they have the right to lionize anyone they wish to, including Godse. But if their intention is to scare the person whom Godse killed by making Godse look like a lion, they are completely mistaken.
This question is a fairly long question, so I'm going to paraphrase. The questioner is from Darjeeling, and he says, as a former governor and diplomat of West Bengal, how do you view the demand of Gorkhaland? And generally speaking, how should the Indian state react when a cultural or linguistic group feel persistently unheard?
I will answer this question by referring to an extraordinary definition of India given by an extraordinary lawyer. Many lawyers I know were in the first session because former Chief Justice was here. Some of them may still be here. Menaka Guruswami has described India in a brilliant way. She says India is a majority of minorities. A majority of minorities. Take this gathering. Take this gathering. One can say there are Hindus here, there are Muslims here, there are other linguistic and ethnic, religious minorities. But at the end of the day, every individual is a minority. Supposing there are 10 Hindus here, each of them is not the same Hindu as the other Hindu. There would be differentiations. Each person, because of lifestyle preferences or political views, is an individual. Every individual in India is a minority in herself and himself. Particularly the female Indian is in a minority in herself or in her association in that gender. And let me also say here that the first major defining legislation in India came from our state, Madras, in the abolition of the Devadasi practice. And Muthu Lakshmi Reddy, in my view, is a constitutional goddess. And that's nothing less than that. I would much rather that the great tradition and asset and cultural mine and gold mine of Bharatanatyam take pause if even one child, even one girl child is in danger of an inherited evil. She had the Devadasi system abolished. But genius of geniuses, Tamil Nadu gave Muthu Lakshmi Reddy the opportunity to abolish an evil. But the same Tamil Nadu gave it Rukmini Devi to say, I will salvage Bharatanatyam from this evil. So Tamil Nadu has the great distinction of giving a kind of example to the definition of minority, majority of minorities. Today, if we remember Gorkhaland or any other section of India's geopolitics wanting autonomy or greater powers, that they reflect this spirit which recognizes the fragility and the inviolability of the individual, then all will be well. I think it is this conscience of the Constitution that can protect India from breaking apart, from the unity which Patel gave us and which Nehru consolidated ideationally.
I have about another dozen questions, but we're out of time. So perhaps when Gopal is signing copies, maybe you could ask the questions when you meet him face to face. All that remains for me to say is thank you very much. It's been a really wonderful experience talking to you. Thank you all for coming.
Let me also just say that for those who could not hear me, I don't know whether I should say sorry or I should say congratulations. You didn't miss anything.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to both gentlemen, Mr. Gopal Krishna Gandhi and Mr. David Davida. Appreciate your thoughts and opinions on a variety of aspects. Thank you. Thank you once again.